we go. So we're at the 1 o'clock session, and in this particular workshop is Think Like a Vegetable. And we're here with Christie Higginbottom, who's going to be our presenter for today. I'll put a link into the schedule again, and also some links for other ways that you can upcoming trustees programs and plant sales. And then I'll share that again at the end. And if you have questions, by all means, you can throw those into chat as we go. And then if there's kind of time, and I don't know, Christy, what your, if you'd rather wait to questions to the end, or if it's okay if they come up partway through,
well, especially if they come up partway through and it indicates that something I've just explained wasn't clear, then yeah,
okay.
If you want to interrupt me and let me know that I need to clarify something, if it's more of a kind of long range kind of question and it can wait until the end, then that's fine. I always worry about going over time with my information because I've got a lot to present, but I also don't want people to feel like they didn't understand something.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well then we'll keep to that. With that, I'll let you start, and I'll mute myself, and if everybody else can make sure you're muted as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Joyce. And I want to thank the trustees for inviting me to participate in this program. I'm not from the Boston area, I'm from Central Mass. My background is that I've worked at Old Sturbridge Village for 41 years. I now just work part-time seasonally since I retired from full-time work. But a good part of my experience there focused on coordinating the historic gardens at Old Sturbridge Village. So I think, have at least one image that was taken from the village gardens, and includes my beet character here on my title slide is a character that was harvested from a garden at Old Sturbridge Village some years ago. So I teach some classes in Central Mass for Tower Hill Botanic Garden and also for the Northeast Organic Farmers, which is, I think, the link that got me invited to participate in this program. And I have enjoyed the morning sessions immensely, and very pleased to present to you today. So Bert the Beet was a beet that we found in our gardens at Old Sturbridge Village some years ago. He showed up with this wonderful nose. And so the costume department here provided him with an outfit. And he is now my poster child for Think Like a Vegetable and for programs that I present on heirloom vegetables. And the Think Like a Vegetable idea really didn't originate with me. Plant empathy was a big part of the instructional methods that I learned from my chief mentor, a man named Paul Rogers, who may be known to Boston area people because he was involved with the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, and he certainly was well known to people in central Massachusetts. Barbara Damrosch said, "Good gardening is very simple, really. You just have to learn to think like a plant." And when I read her quote and combined it with what I had learned from Paul Rogers, it made a lot of sense to me, and my talk really grew out of that experience. So in thinking like a plant, one of the things I usually like to emphasize is one of the best ways that we can empathize with a plant is via stress. We've all experienced stress in our lives in one way or another, and we know how that can impact our output, our health, our relationships with other people. And the same kind of things can be said about plants. So if we can begin to think about plants almost the way we might think about friends, family, and neighbors, then I think it helps us to work more closely with them and to collaborate with them and provide them what they need without stressing them. So stress, vegetable stress, is going to make plants much more susceptible to disease and insect problems. Actually, insects, you would think insects would be like us when we grocery shop. You would think they would look for the healthiest, most vigorous vegetable plants to attack, when in fact, it's often our experience in the garden that the worst insect attacks come to vegetables that are struggling. And one reason for that is that stress often influences the vegetable's ability to take up water. And that means that the sugars become more concentrated in those plant tissues, making them a much more appealing diet for many vegetables. Stress will cut down the yield on our crops. If crops are stressed, they're just not going to be able to create the output that we're looking for. And another thing I will talk about in more detail as we go along is that stress will encourage the premature flowering and seeding, what we call bolting. When a vegetable suddenly stops its productive growth and it moves to its final stage of growth, flowering quickly and then making seeds and getting ready to just give it up, that is often caused by stress, and we want to prevent that. So one of the ways to help us think about all of this is to get to know vegetables as families. You've probably used the term or heard the term vegetable or plant families, and it makes a connection to human experiences that can help us understand more about these plants. The vegetables that we commonly grow in our gardens belong to the plant families that you see illustrated here. And if we can understand something about which vegetables are in the same family, it can enable us to take advantage, as long as we have the room in our gardens, take advantage of crop rotation, of not planting vegetables in the same family year after year in the same ground, but moving them around to different spaces in the garden. I realize, because I don't garden on a huge scale, I realize that crop rotation can be challenging when you have a small scale garden like many people might have in community gardens, for example. But crop rotation is worth following to the extent that you can do that, because it will help to prevent disease and insects building up in the soil. Individual plant families, like many cultural groups, oftentimes can share a propensity for certain kinds of health problems. And by growing them in the same place year after year, we can intensify that. So it's better to move them to new locations. But crop rotation can also be beneficial, not only preventing problems, but it can maintain and improve soil nutrition, and it can improve the structure of the soil. And I'll go into more detail on that. One of the most important plant families to think about in our gardens is the Solanaceae family, the nightshade family, because it includes crops that are really common in most people's New England gardens, particularly the tomato, peppers, eggplants, and potatoes. These crops share a number of common diseases, and so moving them from place to place in the garden helps to prevent those diseases from building up in the soil. A lot of plant diseases can overwinter in the soil in the garden, especially diseases that are funguses or bacterial-based diseases. They can remain in the soil from season to season and increase in the soil. Also, insects can often overwinter in the soil right under the area where a particular crop was growing. With the Solanaceae family, another important thing to keep in mind is that with these plants, and this is true not only of this one plant family, but these plants in this family are very susceptible to a number of fungal diseases. We've been struggling with those, especially with our tomatoes, but also with potatoes, getting worse as climate change gets worse, as we experience more humidity during our summer months. The problem with that is that humid conditions keep the foliage of our plants wet, and spore-borne diseases are spread by dust-like spores that are circulating in the air. They can travel for miles, and as they blow in the air, they are much more easily able to access plants when that foliage is wet, because these dust-like spores will blow about and they'll stick onto wet foliage. And because these plants share those plant diseases, one of the things we want to remember when we're growing them is that we want to try not to wet the foliage of those plants if we can avoid it. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. And we also want to avoid working around the plants when they're wet, because if we do, we can get these spore-borne diseases on our hands or our tools, and then we can move them around in the garden without even realizing it. Another thing to keep in mind with plants in this family is that we want to avoid high nitrogen fertilizers. As I'll mention shortly, again, high nitrogen fertilizers tend to promote the growth of stems and leafy green foliage in plants. These plants all need to develop that, But if we use high nitrogen on them, we will be pushing them into leafy growth at the expense of fruiting growth. And if you're growing tomatoes or peppers or eggplants, you don't want the plant to make a huge leafy shrub and never begin fruiting. And so we want to avoid high nitrogen fertilizers. These plants, I just listening to the soil test session, which confirmed what I'm going to be saying about calcium. Calcium is a great ingredient to help prevent certain disease and problems and health problems that are shared by plants in this family. And so adding calcium, either by adding lime, or if your soil pH does not require lime, eggshells or gypsum to the soil, which will put some calcium in the vicinity of the roots of these plants, and this is good for them. We don't want to lime potatoes, however, because potatoes actually are more comfortable in a soil that's slightly on the acid side. So we avoid adding lime into areas where we're going to be planting our potatoes. Another plant family for whom crop rotation is really most critical are the Brassicas, the crucifers, the cabbage family members. And they include a lot of very hardy plants, plants that can withstand quite a bit of cool weather: cabbages, broccoli, cauliflower, radishes, turnips. They share a lot of diseases, just like the Solanaceae plants do. These plants share diseases such as one called clubroot, which can cause a thickening of the roots of the plant that can interfere with circulation to these plants. All of the members of this family are susceptible to that. And that clubroot disease can remain and increase in the soil. So it's another reason for crop rotation among these plants. And they share certain pest problems. Flea beetles can attack them, especially when they're very young seedling plants. And there are several moth larvae that I'll be talking about that are also attracted to them. All of the Brassica family are very heavy feeders. They have large root systems. If you've ever pulled up a broccoli plant or a cauliflower plant from the soil at the end of the growing season, you might have noticed how far reaching those roots are. So they have large root systems. Plants like that are heavy feeders. They're reaching out to try and access just as much nutrient as they can. So well-prepared, nutrient-rich organic soil, which is high in nitrogen, that's going to be important for most of these crops. Well-rotted manure dug in well ahead of the planting, as with many of these kinds of slow-release fertilizers, preparing the soil ahead in the fall for the area where you know you're going to be putting these plants in the following spring. That's a really good way to prepare the soil for them. And because they're very hungry, something we often don't think about in our gardens, we enrich the soil before we plant our plants, and then we kind of think, okay, we've fed them. But that's kind of like putting out food on the buffet table before anybody gets up to eat. After everybody gets up and starts eating, you know, people have got to come in and refresh those dishes, add new food. And the same thing is true with the plants in our garden. In the beginning, they're going to use a lot of those nutrients. As they then begin to produce their useful crop, heads of broccoli, heads of cauliflower, cabbages, they're going to need continuing nutrition in order to provide the special energy they need for that hard work. And so we want to do what we call top dressing or side dressing. What that means is utilizing things like compost, well broken down manures, or organic fertilizer blends, spreading those on the surface of the soil on either side of growing plants, and then lightly tickling those into the soil, and doing that during the growing season when the plants are going to need an extra boost of nutrition. Also, liquid fertilizers, liquid feeds like seaweed emulsion, fish emulsion, or compost teas, because these are already dissolved in water, these are immediately accessible to plants. It's like intravenous feeding for people. It will be something that the plants can feed on right away and get the nutrients. It also means, though, that because these foods are already dissolved in water, they're going to leach out or wash out of the soil much more quickly than those slow release organic fertilizers. And so it's a key for us with all of our plants in the garden to have a balance between slow release fertilizers that will be broken down gradually by soil microorganisms into a form that then can be dissolved in water, and then the plants can get to them, can eat them, and liquid fertilizers, which have already gone through that dissolving process. And calcium or lime, again, for the brassicas, will help to prevent clubroot disease by strengthening the cell walls of the plants to help them to resist that disease. Some plant families can actually, we can move them around in the garden because of the benefits that they will provide. And root vegetables from a couple of plant families, like the umbelliferas, the carrot family, which includes things like carrots and parsnips, or the beetroot family. These root vegetables, as they grow down into the soil, the big tuberous roots will push that soil aside and open it up. Soil has to be reasonably loose for those plants to grow in the first place, but they will open that soil up. And so the year after they've grown on a piece of ground, the soil will be very easy for fine hair-rooted crops like lettuces, for example, to move their roots into and access. So moving root vegetables around in the garden leaves the soil behind them in a good condition. So there's benefit from that. Likewise, the bean and pea family, legumes. These are crops which have a special relationship with rhizobia bacteria that live in our garden soil. By teaming up with this bacteria, legume plants can form what you see in the image on the right here. They can extract nitrogen out of the air, so they're not even dependent on the nitrogen that we've put into the soil in our garden. They can take nitrogen right out of the air, extract it, and then form it into these lumpy nodules, like you see on the image of a root over here on the right. When they do that, they're actually enriching the soil rather than robbing nutrients out of the soil. They're adding nutrients back to the soil. Many cover crops, like clovers, for example, are members of this family, and it's one of the reasons why they are so beneficial to maintain on the surface of the soil when you don't have your vegetable crops actively growing there, because they're enriching that soil, taking up nitrogen and fixing it on the roots. What this also means is at the end of the growth season of beans and peas, it's a good idea to simply cut those plants at the ground surface if you're going to be cleaning up your garden, and leave those roots in the ground in your garden to decompose. If there's any reason why you feel you have to take them out, then put them into your compost where the decomposing can actually be helpful. Getting to what plants are going to need to help them avoid stress, the most obvious and one of the most critical is sunlight. Because the vegetable plants that we commonly grow in our gardens, the vast majority of those have been developed by seed selection that worked from plants that were grown out in the open where they got a sufficient amount of sunlight. For many of us, myself included in my home garden, it can be challenging sometimes to choose a garden place where you're going to get 6 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sunlight for your vegetables. If you can't get that, that's going to cause some stress. And if there's absolutely nothing you can do about it, you're going to be prepared to deal with that vegetable stress by trying to make sure that those plants don't suffer other stresses along with the stress of insufficient light. But this is one, if your plants are not doing well and they're not getting 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, this could very well be the underlying cause of that problem. When it comes to temperature, though, plants have their own preferences. There are some that really like it hot. The tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, the squashes, melons, cukes, and beans. These are heat-loving plants. They're not going to be happy in the garden until the nighttime temperatures are really warm. And night temperatures are something that we as humans don't think about much. We're asleep when the temperature during the night, and so we don't really often actively experience nighttime temperatures. So when we talk about temperature, we tend to focus on the day, and we'll think about, oh, what was it like when I was out weeding my garden or prepping my soil at 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we can make judgments based on that. Plants do a lot of their growing overnight. During the day, when the sun is out, they use that sunlight to photosynthesize, to be able to process nutrients and store those nutrients in their plant tissues. But when the sun is gone, then they can shift gears, and a lot of their growing activity happens at night when the sun isn't out. Because that's a chemical process, temperatures are critical. And so plants that don't do that well in cold temperatures are going to be stressed if they're in the ground when the temperature is lower than the temperature that they can operate well in overnight. And so if you have a thermometer that will tell you what the lowest temperature was overnight while you were asleep, that's really helpful to determine when to get those plants out into the garden and when it's still too cold overnight to do that. A lot of plants really like it cool. I think traditionally for so many of us, especially here in New England, I know when I was growing up, Memorial Day was always the traditional time to start your garden, because so many home gardeners focused on things like tomatoes, for example, and cucumbers, and those really couldn't get started before the night temperatures were warm. Now that we're extending our growth more, many home gardeners are including a lot of cool weather vegetables. And what we need to know is those vegetables actually want to start growing in the garden well before Memorial Day, because they like cool temperatures. If we wait too late to get them started and those night temperatures get too hot, they're not going to be comfortable. They're going to be stressed in those temperatures. So keeping in mind which ones like it cool, like the peas, the lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, radishes, kale, and which ones prefer it hot, is going to help you to plan out the planting schedule in your garden. So when you're getting started, you need to think about, okay, what plants that I commonly grow in my garden need to be started ahead indoors, either by growing my own seedlings indoors under lights or buying them from a local nursery where they've been started inside. And the ones that are most critical in that regard are tender vegetables, ones that can't withstand frost at all and need those warmer night temperatures, things like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. They need a long time from the time the plant is started until you can begin harvesting. And our own growing season doesn't provide a temperature range for a long enough period of time to do that. So we have to jumpstart them indoors, somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks before they can actually move outside. But there are a lot of things that we can start by direct sowing them, actually putting the seeds right into the ground in the garden. And those include root vegetables. Root vegetables hate transplanting. They can't stand transplanting at all. And so it doesn't make any sense to try and start those indoors. They wouldn't move easily. And so you want to direct sow those, put the seed right in the ground in the garden where they're going to grow. Because we grow potatoes from pieces, either whole or pieces of the actual potato tuber, we plant those directly in the ground outside. Similarly, garlic, which gets planted in the fall here in New England, when you would plant other bulbs like daffodils and crocuses, and because we're planting a piece of a bulb, a clove, we plant those. The best thing is to plant those directly into the soil in the garden. Peas and beans could be started indoors, but you don't gain anything from that. And because you need a lot of plants of each of these crops to provide you with the harvest you want, for most people, it's just not practical to try and start enough peas and beans plants indoors. And legume seeds germinate really quickly and get growing very fast. So you don't gain anything. In fact, if you started them indoors and then moved them outside, the stress of that transplanting could actually slow those small plants down, and things grown directly from seed could move along much more quickly. Some of the plants in our garden can be sown either way, and this might allow you to grow 2 plantings of something. to start things like broccoli seedlings, for example, indoors to set outside for a harvest that you might be expecting to make before the beginning of July, and then starting some things outdoors for a later harvest that might come in the fall. And crops that work that way include things like broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower. Also, Brussels sprouts, which is going to take the full garden season, is easy to start outside in the ground. Likewise, lettuce can be started either way. Swiss chard and many other greens, you can start earlier crops. I have some growing under lights right now that are ready to go outside to harden off and get ready to move into my garden. But then because you're going to be eating those leafy crops, you're going to want a succession sow to direct sow some of the seed into the ground after you set out your transplants, so that after you eat those early lettuces, you'll have later lettuces coming along to keep you satisfied throughout the growing season. Cucumbers, squashes, and melons can be started indoors, but they don't like root disturbance. And so starting them indoors means you have to be very careful not to let them get too big before you move them outside. If they're too big, they'll not only be awkward indoors, but their root systems will be much more liable to be damaged or injured when you transplant them. And that can stress them, it can set them back, or even make them get ill and not produce for you at all. Onions can be started either way, but I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about those in just a minute. Here's a chart that I've prepared that kind of allows you to visualize how starting indoors can work. The little brown pot, little brown pot images that you see here show you the period of time when you would be starting the seeds in pots inside, and those things would be growing on indoors. When you move to the little green plant symbols, that shows you the period of time when you might be moving those started plants outdoors into the garden. And then the long green line shows you when they're going to be growing on out in your garden. And so this will give you a sense for the range of things that you might be starting, like onions, for example. In order to grow those well from started seeds indoors, those seeds have to be started really early. Really, it's too late now to start onion seeds indoors for onion production this season. They really needed to be underway in February. And then others, like I mentioned, things like the melons and the squashes and so forth, it's better if those don't get started until just a couple of weeks before you're going to be putting them outside, because you don't want them to get too large. And the key to a lot of this is temperature hardiness for these crops. So you'll see in the bottom scale, the key here to things that are very tender. In other words, they won't survive any frost at all, and they would be damaged. They might not be killed, but they'd be damaged if the temperatures dropped down below 40 degrees while they were outside. To tender things, those won't survive frost, but they can take some of those cooler temperatures. Moderately hardy, those are plants that can take a light frost, but not a heavy one. Hardy are things that can survive a frost and even temperatures down into the 20s. And then very hardy plants, which with a little bit of protection can actually live right through the winter. And kale, for example, is one of those. This chart gives you a sense for planting things directly outside. So with this chart, the images that show the seeds, that shows you the period of time when you might be actually planting those outside. And for early ones like the arugula up at the top, the key to when you can start planting things directly outdoors is as soon as the ground can be worked. And that's kind of a hard to define phrase. And that phrase, that description, can vary a lot, even from one person's garden here in Massachusetts to another garden in Massachusetts. What it means is that when you go out into your garden, you're going to be loosening the soil, feeling the soil with your hands. When that soil, when you go out into the garden and you pick up a wad of that soil and you squeeze it and it stays all bound together like a mud ball, then the ground is not ready to be worked. It's too wet. If the ground is still too cold, it's not going to be ready to be worked. What we're looking for, and the soil temperatures, as you can see in the column on the right, the soil temperatures are going to vary for particular crops. Something like lettuce can go into the ground when the soil temperature is as cold as 40 degrees. Many of these other crops, the temperature you want to be somewhere between 45 and 55 degrees. So soil temperature needs can vary from, preferences can vary from one crop to another, but the soil needs to be dry enough that it's not clumping together like mud, and warm enough to suit the needs of the particular crop. As soon as it can be worked for that crop, then we can begin planting. The other thing that we think about with our crops as we're planting our garden is how long is it going to take from the time I put my seeds into the ground until I can begin harvesting that crop. Some of the crops we grow in our kitchen gardens are very fast. Something like a radish, for example, in 20 to 30 days. From the time you put your seed in the ground, 20 to 30 days, you'll be eating radishes. Other things like the full season crops you see at the bottom, something like parsnips, for example, can take 120 days. We put the seed in the ground early, as early as the middle of April or early May. But in order for parsnips to really be good for harvest, you want them to go through cold temperatures. You want them to have had some frost to sweeten the roots. So they're going to be occupying the ground in your garden throughout the whole growing season, from the time you put the seeds in the ground until, even if you want to leave them in the ground, they'll be hardy enough to stay in the ground through the winter. And when the ground first thaws in the spring, that's when we enjoy our most flavorful parsnips. So keeping days to maturity in mind is something that will also help you when you are planning your garden, figuring out whether, for example, if you grow radishes, by the end of May or by the middle of June, probably the radishes you planted in April or early May are all eaten up. So that means you've now got a piece of empty ground for something that would like to go into the ground when the soil and the air temperatures are warm. So you can plan for what's called succession sowing, one crop to follow another, and you get a full season harvest out of your garden and keep the ground covered with growing material, which is much healthier for your soil. Find this information. The best way is to have a good seed catalog. A good garden advice book is helpful. The great thing about many seed catalogs, like the image that you see on the screen here from Territorial Seed Company's catalog, is that a good seed catalog will give you a wealth of information about all of the details of growing a particular crop in a very small, very concise way. And so it becomes, I keep my favorite seed catalogs on hand, not just to order seeds from, but to give me a quick access to the specifics that I'm going to need for growing this particular crop. So it includes things like its culture, how to prepare the soil before you plant it, what the temperature needs to be in order to get that plant out, how deep to sow the seeds, to direct sow them. With lettuce, as described here, for example, lettuce needs a little bit of light penetrating the soil to reach the seed in order to germinate. And so this advice will tell you to cover the seeds very lightly, not too heavily. And then it tells you how to do transplants. It gives you advice about potential insect and pest problems. And so this is a great source. A good seed package will often give you this kind of information as well. Several companies that I find extremely helpful in terms of the level of information they provide on seed packages and in their catalogs are some of the New England seed companies like Johnny's up in Maine, High Mowing in Vermont, Fedco in Maine, but also the West Coast company Territorial Seeds, as I mentioned earlier. These are good catalogs to collect and have on hand to provide you with access. And as long as I've been gardening, I still go back and double check details on planting times and spacing and other things before I do my planting. But then this allows you to make a plan of your garden. And I highly recommend this, even starting in the fall when your previous year's garden plan is fresh in your mind, and you can build on that in order to make good decisions about the coming year. This is my home garden, which is divided into 4 quarters. It's a traditional 4-square garden plan that allows me to do a crop rotation. So you'll notice that one whole quarter of this garden is planted with those Solanaceae crops. So that way next year I can move the whole bunch of them together to another quarter. And this Brassica group can then move ahead of it down here. I grow my roots together, so they're preparing the soil really well, so that then the onions and the fibrous rooted plants can move into that territory and take advantage. So thinking ahead, and if your garden is grown to scale, it also allows you to use the information you have about the spacing that your crops prefer in order to make good growth. And you can plot that all out ahead of time, makes planting much easier when you're actually starting to put transplants or seeds into the ground. For online digital plan methods to do this, I use my old graph paper, but I've also moved into using a website, and I know there are probably several of these available, but one is called growveg.com, which has a lot of tools to help you do, if you like working in this format, that helps you to do a digital plan. It also stores plans from year to year to help you make decisions about what to do to follow crops another year. And this is what that garden, to give you a sense of what all of this looks like on the ground, this is what that garden would look like around the middle of June in my home landscape. So moving on to preparing the soil to meet needs of many of these plants. Soil nutrients can be confusing at times. So again, what we're doing is we're putting out that buffet, that meal for our plants, and different plants and different plant families are going to require or want or go to particular nutrients more than others. And so feeding the soil is the key here. Our soil contains a whole population. If we're careful about how we manage our soil, it will have a population of living entities, starting from really small bacteria, working all the way up to larger visible things like earthworms. And what these are doing is they're breaking down what we call slow release fertilizers. That includes the organic materials like our compost that you see in my wheelbarrow here, or rotted manures, but also solid organic fertilizers that you might purchase. These organic fertilizers, when they're added to the ground, they are broken down by the soil microorganisms into, as I said earlier, forms that now can be dissolved in water. And that's how our plants access those. They can't just directly get the nutrients out of this. They need those cooks, the soil microorganisms, to do the cooking and get it ready to serve. And then they're ready to go. And as I mentioned, liquid feeds like fish emulsion and compost tea, these are great to add nutrients also when plants are producing, along with top dressing or side dressing with some of the slow release fertilizers to replace the ones that have already been used up and eaten. And as a simple basic, going into fertilizers would take a whole presentation here, but just a simple, very simplified breakdown. On our fertilizer packages, when we buy them, we usually get NPK numbers, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium numbers, and that can be confusing. In a kind of nutshell, it's not really as simple as this, but to help you with it, nitrogen promotes green growth. It builds stems and leaves. If plants in your garden are looking really yellowed or weak in their leaf and stem growth, it could be diseases, but it could be a lack of nitrogen in the soil, the nutrient they need in order to make that strong, healthy growth. And so if you think of it, crops where we depend on leaves, lettuce, for example, Swiss chard, spinach, these are crops that are going to require a higher level of nitrogen in order to produce the level of harvest that we're looking for. Phosphorus helps to support root growth, flowers, and developing fruits. So all of our plants are going to need some phosphorus, but in particular, root vegetables are going to be more hungry for it, and fruiting plants. And by fruits, I use that word very broadly. Any soft part of a plant that the plant creates in order to be the vehicle of the seed is a fruit. So a cucumber is a fruit, a tomato is a fruit, a green bean is a fruit. So when I'm talking about fruit producing plants in the vegetable department, that's what I'm talking about, not the culinary sense of fruits. Potassium is a nutrient that supports flowers and fruit growth, but it also helps to build health in plants and enables disease resistance in plants. And so this, again, is an important ingredient to have in place for all our healthy plants. And then micronutrients, or trace elements, as they're often called, including things like calcium, magnesium, boron, and sulfur. These are critical elements, and what you'll want to do is study individual plants to see which ones need those the most. I'm going to talk in more detail, a little bit more detail about calcium later on, but boron in particular is a micronutrient that beets particularly need in order to be healthy. And so the soil where they're going to be growing should have an adequate supply of boron. And of course, the soil test, as was explained so well in the earlier presentation, is a great way to measure this in your garden, and then done every 3 years or so to help you know whether what you are doing when you're adding or amending your soil is getting you the results that you intended. So to an organic gardener, soil is the most important aspect of a garden, and building and maintaining fertile, healthy soil is a first priority. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep our soil loose. Once we have a garden prepared, we want to keep the soil loose by not walking on the areas where we're going to be planting our plants. That means we establish some paths for walking on in our garden. We might establish smaller alleys between 3 to 4 foot wide garden beds so that we can approach the work to our beds by standing in the alleys and reaching into the bed rather than walking in the bed itself. Once that soil is loose and well established, that means we can add nutrients to it each year and loosely blend them into the soil without turning the soil too much. Turning the soil too much can completely mix up all those soil microorganisms that have established themselves in the levels in the soil where they're comfortable. We want to try and keep them in those levels where they can work their best. We want to be able to work the nutrients into the soil, but we want to find a compromise between working them in and keeping the soil strata established as well as possible. So this is kind of a balance in preparing our soil. And then once that soil is prepared, we can create a traditional garden bed, where is the kind of structure where we grow most of our seeded crops, especially any of those like beets, which I'm going to be seeding here in this prepared bed. Any of those crops that we're going to plant the seed in rows, we can space those across the bed. So having tools at hand to be able to make nice straight lines, a garden rule, which is what the stick is that you see here, a 6 foot long piece of wood marked out by feet, and the first 2 feet marked out in inches. That allows careful measuring in the garden, which can mean that you can get the most out of a small amount of space without crowding plants, giving them the amount of space they need, as we learn when we talk about each one, and yet not giving them more space than they need so that we can make the best employment and get the best yield out of our gardens. I'm going to take a look at some specific crops. You can get to know them a little better, feel some plant empathy for them. And I'll start with lettuce, which is one of my favorites. It has so much to recommend it. Lettuce is one of the easiest crops to grow. If you think of people you know that are just really easy to get along with, lettuce is a vegetable that's really easy to get along with. It has one concern. It doesn't like to get too hot or too dry. And if we can keep that in mind and make it feel comfortable with temperature and moisture, then usually it will do almost anything we want it to do. And it comes in all kinds of colors and shapes and types. It's very hardy. So you can get it, as I mentioned earlier, you can get it into the ground as soon as the ground can be worked, and we can plant it late and have lettuce in the fall, even into the winter and beyond if we protect it. It can even make a wonderful border for ornamental beds because it's really pretty to look at. You can sow it outside as soon as the ground can be worked. You can start some indoors. You can create a cold frame. I'll show a picture of one in a minute to get an early start. If you want to grow your lettuce plants until they make a full-sized head of lettuce, then they need to be spaced about 6 inches to 12 inches apart. But if you just want to have cutting greens that you can harvest as fresh greens for salads and sandwiches and other uses, you can grow them closer together than that. And they transplant very easily. So that means if you have a bunch of lettuces coming up in your garden and they're growing too close together, you don't need to throw away or eat your thinnings. You can move those thinnings around into open spaces in your garden, in a flower pot, in an ornamental garden, anywhere where there's room and sufficient light for your lettuce to grow. You can pick it up and move it, and it will be very comfortable. Germination of lettuce seeds can be inhibited by hot weather. So we have a really hard time getting lettuce seed to germinate by July, when those soil temperatures have risen to the point where the seed just won't germinate. It's comfortable at cool temperatures, but when it gets too hot, it's not going to germinate. So this can be challenging to start lettuce plants midsummer. So timing your plantings and starting small amounts periodically that you can then transplant to prepare ahead for the heat in the middle of the summer when it's going to be more difficult to get plants started is a good idea. You can try and mitigate these things by shading a particular piece of ground ahead of time to try and keep it cool, shading it or mulching over it to keep that that soil temperature cooler where you're going to be putting your lettuce seed. Sow the seed late in the afternoon. And in the summertime, lettuce will actually appreciate some light shade. So that means lettuce seedlings can be transplanted to go, for example, under the tall poles of pole beans, where it will tolerate the lighter shade below the beans and actually appreciate that little bit cooler temperature. It needs consistent moisture and protection from extreme heat to prevent it from what's called premature bolting. The lettuce is an annual, which means its whole life cycle happens in one growing season, from a seed getting into the ground and being born as a plant to producing seed and then dying as a mature plant. All of that is going to happen within one growing season. And all of our plants are in their primary contract with Mother Nature. The most important agreement in that contract is that somewhere in their lifespan, they have to produce seed in order to guarantee the next generation. For annuals, this becomes a pretty desperate thing because they don't have much time to do it. So if they're stressed, they're going to rush to flower and ripen seeds. Here on the right, you see a lettuce plant that has bolted, sent up a flower spike and ripening seeds. Dryness and heat will stimulate that, make it happen more quickly than it normally would. It's going to happen eventually anyway in the course of one growing season, but it's an annual, and when it's stressed by excessive heat, it's going to bolt. And once lettuce begins to bolt, you're going to find that the flavor goes to a very bitter flavor. And so we're trying to prevent bolting from happening. It's great for interplanting. As I mentioned, it will tolerate some shade, so you can lift small seedlings and put them between the rows where you have space between wider spaced crops. Lettuce will tolerate that. If it begins to get really big and crowd your other crops, it's ready to eat at any time. So you can just take it out and eat it, and you'll be fine. You won't lose it. Here are a bunch of small lettuce seedlings that I transplanted out. I wasn't even really fussy about it. In fact, you can see in some of these little groupings, there are actually a couple of different plants growing together. I was looking to grow leaf lettuce and early lettuce that I could just simply cut as small leaves rather than heading up. So it's planted close together. And that's what it looks like in July. So this is one of the ways to grow lettuce. You can also extend the season for lettuce in the fall because it's very cold tolerant. What I typically do is toward the middle of September, I form a bed in my garden that is the same dimension as my cold frame, this wooden box that you see here. And I sow out seeds of lettuces, and there are other fall greens like kale and mustard greens growing in this plot here. And then when the weather gets cold enough that they need some shelter, I just bring my frame out, set it on the ground, and then I can add the sash to it, and I can keep those growing right up until Thanksgiving and even Christmas some years. And some years I've wintered over things right through the whole winter and have them begin new growth again in the spring. So these are really versatile crops. With the onion's a very interesting vegetable. We said lettuce was an annual, lives its whole life cycle in one growing season. Onions are biennials. They're native part of the world, and this is an important thing to understand with crops, to have that empathy. If we know where they came from, it helps us to know how to grow them, what kind of conditions they love. They're cold hardy, and they are biennials, which means they're programmed to live for only 2 years. Biennial plants sort out how they grow. The first year a biennial grows, it focuses on making a root system of some kind and making leafy top growth. And because it's going to rest between the first year and the second year, go dormant, as we say, it needs to create some method for it to be able to store the food it made the first year, so that it now has a food supply ready to go in the second year. In the second year, it's going to spend its energy primarily on making flowers and going to seed. Not much energy spent on leaf growth, because it had stored some energy that it could use in that second year. Understanding this helps us to understand more about how to grow onions successfully. The bulb, the part we eat, the onion bulb, is the food storage organ that this plant has made. It's made of specialized leaves that is designed to hold the food it made the first year and provide that food supply the next year. And the bulb is designed to withstand very dry conditions, because the part of Asia where it naturally lived during the period of the year when it was dormant, or the winter when the days were short, there wasn't enough light to grow, the ground is very dry. So the onion had to create a food storage organ that could stay alive when the conditions were really dry. Onions are day length sensitive. All plants are paying attention to how long the day and the night are, but onions are particularly paying attention to this. So while the days are lengthening, as they are right now, the onion is going to focus its attention on making leafy growth. So when the seed germinates, it starts making leaves. As long as the days are getting longer, it's very comfortable with that. However, when we reach the summer solstice, there's a message that goes to the onion from Mother Nature saying, uh-oh, the calendar is starting to shorten. You've only got a certain amount of time now between your leaf growth and when you're going to have to go dormant. So you better shift gears and start focusing on making your bulb. It has to do that when the days reach a critical period, which can vary slightly from one onion variety to another. It has to do that whether it has made a lot of leaves to make a big bulb, or it's made only a few leaves to make a tiny bulb. And so bulb formation begins sort of around early May and gets really serious around the solstice. When the days grow shorter and the nights grow longer, then onions mature their bulbs and they'll go dormant. The size of your onion is dependent on the amount of top growth it was able to achieve. So the earlier you plant your onion, the more top growth you're going to have and the larger bulb you're going to get. Now this one down here, this Ailsa Craig onion, is pretty huge. We don't usually expect them to get that big, although I've had some that have been about half that size. There are several ways to plant our onions. The way I do it, and the method that I have found with my own trial and error to be the best, is to start them indoors under lights. And I do that usually sometimes at the very end of January, often the first week of February, and then plant those seedlings out in my garden as soon as the ground can be worked and as soon as I've given them time to kind of moving them in and out of my house to get them used to the outdoors, hardening them off as it's called. You can also sow seed directly in the garden. New Englanders did that years ago when they didn't have easy grow lights or facilities to start them indoors, but that's challenging. So I don't recommend it. I've tried it at Old Sturbridge Village and we've done it, but it's probably the hardest method to grow onions, especially here in New England. Or you can purchase onion sets and you can plant those in the garden from April to the early part of May. Just like the other methods, the sooner you can get them in the ground, the bigger your onions are going to be. Onion sets are actually little onion bulbs that were grown from seed under very crowded conditions so that they ripened prematurely. What you're hoping is that that tiny little bulb, when you put it in the ground, it's going to believe that it isn't fully ripe yet, and it's going to sort of pick up where it left off and continue to make a bulb, making leafy growth and building a bulb to get a larger onion. For this reason, you should, when you're choosing onion sets, you shouldn't buy the biggest ones. They're the ones that are most likely to have moved over from year 1 to year 2. And if they have, what they're going to do is they're going to make a kind of thick stem, which would be a flower stem, and they're not going to do much onion building at all. So you sometimes don't get a good onion from a big set. Choose healthy medium-sized ones and plant them with the tip facing upward, and that tip maybe about a ½ inch or so below the surface, and spacing them about 4 inches apart in rows 12 to 18 inches apart. They need this much room in order to make a decent sized onion. Of course, the spacing can vary depending on the variety of onion that you're trying to grow. Okay. So here, just to show how that works, here are a bunch of onion seedlings that I'm planting out in the garden in April. This was the 26th of April, as you can see from my garden tag here, when they first went out into the ground, spaced out from seedlings that I had started indoors. By June, the onions have made these leafy tops. So they're building good leafy tops, and they're starting, and their bulbs are forming down below ground underneath the mulch here. In August, this slide was taken on the 18th of August, those bulbs have matured. If you want to eat onions during the growing season, you can pull out an onion and eat it as soon as feeling around the base of the leaves, you find that there's a bulb in there big enough to be worth eating. You can pull it out and eat it fresh at any time. But if you want to grow onions to store them for a long time, you want them to be dormant. You want them to have shut down and make the chemical changes they would make to stay dormant normally and naturally. And so you want to wait until that has happened. The cue that that's happened is that the leaves will thin above the bulb and the leaves will fall over. And these are onions curing for storage, to get them ready then to be braided up and hung for storage in a cellar. I'm getting close to my end of time, am I not?
We're getting there. A quick question, just on the onions. How do scallions and chives compare to that in regards to their growing process?
Okay, chives are a perennial, so they're different. They're not a biennial like an onion. So you would start those. The best way to start chives is from a plant, but you can start with seeds and grow plants, and then they're just going to keep coming up from that same root base every single year. They're a perennial. Chives, scallions. Scallions are varieties of onions that have been selected to stay at a smaller size. And so those are not harvested for storage, they're harvested for fresh eating. If you want to call a young immature onion a scallion, you could actually pull out and eat one of your regular onions as a scallion when the bulb was still small. But official scallions are particular varieties that are designed not to mature large, but to be harvested when they're still small. Okay. Okay, I'm afraid I may not make it to the end here in my next 10 minutes, but we'll just do our best. Peas are another cool weather crop. They really like it cold. They can withstand some frost, so they can be planted anywhere from the end of March to early May when the ground can be worked. You don't want to put them out when the soil temperature is much below 50 degrees, and you don't want to put them out while the soil is still wet or the seed will rot. They don't like heat and dry weather, however. And so what this means is as soon as you get your peas in the ground and they begin to grow, it's a good idea to mulch the soil. That will insulate the soil and help to keep the soil temperature cool as the plants grow. Peas are going to be needing some kind of support as they grow. Pea varieties can vary from varieties that only get about 18 inches tall to some that'll be 5 or 6 feet tall. And of course, as you might guess, the taller ones are going to even need more support, and they're going to need support that's higher. So you're going to need to choose a support system geared to the size of the peas. Peas as a legume can be sown close together. Because they can draw nutrients from the air as well as the soil, they don't mind competition from one another as much. And so one method is to make a trench, as you see here on the left, about 4 inches deep. Cover the pea seed at the beginning with soil that's a couple of inches deep. And then as the peas grow, fill the trench in with soil. That will keep the roots of the peas down in cooler soil, keeping them happier, and then mulch them. Peas, when you're going to support plants, it's important to pay attention to how they climb. Peas climb with tendrils, little hair-like fingers that can grip on. They don't twine around something like a bean vine does. And so peas can't grow up a pole. What they need is a network in order to support them. Traditionally, what people did was to use brush. If you are doing pruning or clearing brush, save fine twiggy brush to push into the rows when your peas are small, and then they will climb up using their tendrils onto this pea brush. Here you see a woman at Old Sturbridge Village harvesting peas from pea brush. It makes the plants healthier, makes harvesting easier, and it's a very natural way to support your pea vines. I'm going to move on to another cool weather crop, broccoli. Broccoli has become a very challenging crop to grow, especially with some of the changes that have occurred recently with climate change. In particular, here in New England, one of the things that has happened is that night temperatures get hot much earlier. If you as a person has found that you can't sleep overnight in late June and July without running your air conditioner, then you can understand how broccoli feels. And we can't air condition our gardens. But broccoli does not like those hot night temperatures, and they're coming earlier and earlier now. So for many of us who used to easily be able to start broccoli seedlings indoors in the spring, put the plants out, and have broccoli develop its heads, its budded heads, by the end of June and early July, for many of us, we find we can't do that anymore. What will happen when the heat and the drought hits the broccoli is, again, like the lettuce, it will rush to bolting. It will, instead of making those nice flower heads that we want to eat, what the broccoli will do, I'm going to skip ahead just a minute. What the broccoli will do is what you see here. In this case, I think in my garden, the situation was made worse because my broccoli plants were growing too close together. And when that happened, the plants these varieties that were more prone to bolting weren't getting enough moisture, and they were too crowded. And so what they did was, instead of making a head of broccoli, they just made a bunch of flowers. If you've had that happen with broccoli recently, it's probably drought and heat stress that has done that. So for a lot of us, the solution has kind of been to grow our broccoli and grow it on as a fall crop. With broccoli, we often start the seedlings ahead of time, and like most cabbage family members, it actually enjoys being transplanted. It doesn't mind it at all. When we set it out, we can set those tiny plants a little deeper than they were growing and put some collars around them, which can prevent damage from various insects that can creep across the soil and gnaw into the stems of our young transplants. So we want to protect them from that. To eliminate stress that can be caused by transplanting, we want to make sure the soil has been well watered before we put them into the ground. We want to make sure that the plants themselves are moist when they go into the ground. If you can do your transplanting on a cloudy, misty day, that's a great time to do it because the plants will appreciate that. They won't be stressed by extra heat and sunlight while they're trying to adjust their roots to the conditions of being transplanted, picked up and then moved and having to get reestablished. It's like us, moving and getting resettled. And again, you want to space your plants wide enough apart. They don't, when you first put them in and they're 18 to 24 inches apart, it's going to maybe look like waste space. Stick some lettuce in there or something like that. But if the broccoli is too close together, the root systems will compete with one another for nutrients and moisture. Up spacing is really critical, and this is especially true with root vegetables. Carrots are a really good example of this. Carrots grow below ground, so we don't see what's growing, and that can mean that we sometimes leave them growing too close together because we don't actually see what's happening down below ground. We can sow these plants. They're very tolerant of cool weather, but they also tolerate heat. So these are very flexible as to when you can sow them. We can start in the spring, and then we can be still sowing some carrots in June and early July that will give us plants in the fall. Thinning, as I said, is critical. When seedlings first appear, they're going to look like this picture that I took in my garden on the top. What we're going to want to do is carefully cut or carefully remove seedlings that are growing right next to one another to space them out so that we've got 2 inches to 3 inches between plants. Keep in mind, you've got to have enough space between plants that would equal the diameter of the size carrot you want to pull from the ground. If you don't have that much room, there's not enough room for the carrots to grow. And what will happen is 2 carrots will often wind around one another if they don't have space to grow independently. So this is what that row looked like after it was thinned. And this is the result that we get from good thinning on our carrots. If your soil is not really deep and loose, choose a variety of carrot that doesn't grow too long. You've got a lot of choices. And by choosing shorter varieties for soil that might be compacted down below, or that you haven't had time to really, or haven't had enough years to really get loosened well, if it's only a shallow loosened soil, choose a variety that doesn't grow as deep as some of the others. And you can tell that by descriptions in your catalogs or on your seed packages. Watering is critical for plants. As I mentioned, water is necessary to dissolve the soil nutrients and make them available to your plants. Water is also, just like for us, being hydrated helps us to maintain an even body temperature because we perspire. Plants do what's called transpiring, but it's the same idea. They give off water, moisture into the air, and that was what keeps their body temperatures at a workable level. If they run out of water, then they're not able to do that. And then heat is going to stress them. They not only can't take up food, but they also can't maintain their structure and their body temperature in the hot weather. When you water, however, as I mentioned earlier, there is always the risk of making plants more susceptible to fungus diseases. To avoid this, if you're going to be watering overhead, like I'm doing with this waterer here on my onions, do it early in the day on a sunny or breezy day. That way the foliage will have time to dry out before night. If you do it late afternoon, it won't dry out. It'll remain wet for a long period of time, opening up the plants to the risk of fungal diseases. If you can use drip irrigation or soaker hoses, then you can help solve this problem. So here are a couple of reasons why watering is critical. On the left, you see what's called blossom end rot disease on tomatoes. And this can happen with tomatoes and peppers. It's due to a calcium deficiency that makes the cell walls very weak and they just break down. If there isn't enough calcium in the plant, then this can happen. We want to make sure calcium levels remain constant, but the only way a plant can take up calcium from the soil is via water. So if the plants are going to dry, if you're stressing them by not watering them deeply enough, not getting the whole root system watered so it can take up the calcium, then you're going to have a calcium deficiency, even if there's plenty of calcium in the soil. Similarly, late blight on the right is this fungal disease that we've been having problems with, and early blight as well now. This disease spreads rapidly by spores in the warm, damp weather. And so we want to avoid the moisture on the surface. How do you do that? How do you prevent these diseases with things like tomatoes? Couple of ways. One, you can water with a watering can, where that allows you to put the water right at the base of the plant and not wet the foliage. You can use soaker hoses buried in the ground, and then this provides a form of drip irrigation that will keep the soil moist around your plants. Buried underneath a leaf mulch, that will keep the soil moisture more consistent, prevent that soil evaporation. The other great thing that the leaf mulch does is it prevents what's called soil splash. These diseases, these spores can remain in the soil under the plants. When you get a heavy rainfall, or if you water with an overhead sprinkler system, that can splash some of that soil up onto the lower leaves and contaminate them with those fungus spores. This is one reason why you often see these diseases begin on the lowest leaves of the plant. Putting down a mulch like this leaf mulch not only holds your soil moisture, but it forms a physical barrier between the top of the soil and the lowest leaves of your plant. And so it can help prevent the soil splash that we can't avoid when Mother Nature sends in a thunderstorm.
And I think we're going to have to wrap because we're already over, but
Okay.
but I don't know if there's any last little bits or wrap up you have that you could do in like the next minute.
Let's see. One other thing I was just going to mention, and I can mention this with regard to beans and also things like cucumbers, any of the plants where we harvest what we call a fruit, is to make sure to keep harvesting. If you allow seeds to mature on plants like green beans or cucumbers, on any of these plants, if you allow fruits to mature their seeds on a plant that is an annual, then the plant has fulfilled its contract with Mother Nature, and you will see production start to slow down. Oftentimes we'll have plants like cucumbers and beans that will produce way more than we're going to, as a family, maybe eat in the next couple of days. And so there's a tendency to just leave those on the plant. You want to pick those, either freeze them, process them, give them away, send them to your food bank, but don't leave them on the plant, because if the seeds begin to ripen in the plant, that will make the plant shut down its production. So keep harvesting.
Thank you, Christie. And thank you for helping us all think like a vegetable. I think that's great, the whole idea of plant empathy. I know, and I mentioned it in chat, the archive video of this and the slides, everybody will get that after the event is over, that the trustees will send that to you. And thank you again, Christie, for this. And then
Okay.
I'm going to stop the recording.